listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.
I am so excited to have you all on the podcast today. I've been wanting to talk about this in depth for a long time. Thank you so much for making time in your busy schedules.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Well, listen, we start with the same question for all our guests who are on for the first time. Because it's very personal and different, there's no right or wrong answer. And that question is, of course, what does home mean to you? We're going to start with Tracy, then go to Sheila, and then end with Joshua.
Well, for me, home doesn't strictly entail the physical construction of a house or a rental accommodation or tent, trailer, camper, or institution. It encompasses so much more. It's really a sense of comfort, a place where you can escape the cruelties of this world, to find a safe haven, and a place of security. So at the optimal end of my continuum of home, home encompasses ideas of love, hospitality, and care, where people can care for themselves and for each other, where they're free to be themselves without judgment, where there's access to other people who can lift you up. If you're having a bad day, if you're having a bad year, where you can really try out and practice new ideas, new hobbies, new activities, where you can eat a meal in silence or with lots of laughter. So really the structure of a building is really the brick and mortar, the material of it, isn't really for me the home piece. For me, it really is about the connections to all the dimensions of what makes us human.
Okay, and for me, ditto is kind of my first answer. But I see things really in two maybe distinct dimensions. The first one really is the kind of belonging that Tracy talked about. It's so, being close to family, being close to friends, being in a neighborhood where we can kind of talk to each other. I have American relatives in Florida where it's becoming harder for people to talk to each other. So that kind of thing really, makes a difference. So Tracy talked a lot about that. I won't elaborate. The physical space for me, though, is kind of interesting. I'm an introvert. And I really need to get away from the world periodically. So my physical space where I have that security and being able to tune the world out and to be able to think is really important to me. I can't think in crowds.
Hard acts to follow, both of you. I think like the two words that always come to mind the most when I think about this are safety and community. Of the places that I've felt that I was home over my life have been places where those two things were at their maximum, where I felt safest physically, emotionally, however you might put it, and where I felt like I was able to connect to the community around me and be supportive of other people. And so, I don't actually think about it as a physical space really at all. It's more of a feeling, a sense of being, but obviously, the physical space that happens in really matters to whether that sense and that feeling can be there.
All wonderful answers, and thank you for that. And Sheila, I really like what all of you said good things, but that piece about too is that when you finally shut that door, you can have your own thoughts. You're finally you can breathe and mentally, think. That's big too. And safety and community, all those different pieces, family and love. Joshua, let's stay with you. Talk to us a little bit. I often say that many of us, this is not one of the choices that was there in grade 3 career day when we talked about what we were going to be. How did you get into this work? Can you talk a little bit about your journey into this work? And then we'll go to Sheila and then end with Tracy.
For sure. So I run an organization devoted to food security, but I don't really come into this as someone from the food movement. I got involved when I was in my early 20s in social activist work on campus, like however many people do. You know, you're doing your degree in something, and you get pulled into on-campus organizing that gradually bleeds into off-campus organizing, right? And then I think I got the sense at the time that I wanted to try and figure out a way to pay the bills while I was doing that kind of work for the rest of my life. And that's looked like a number of different things for me. I moved to Newfoundland and Labrador in my early 20s. I spent a number of years working for our community sector council, which is kind of the network organization for the nonprofit sector out here. Got to know kind of the shape of the sector, and then moved into youth homelessness. Actually, I worked for an organization called Choices for Youth for a number of years. So Michael, I think we've met the odd time at conferences and things. Spent a bunch of time there on the kind of program planning side, and then landed at Food First NL. And I think the way I think about it is that, to me, food and food systems work is just such a powerful lever. It's a place where people engage really emotionally in a way that lets you move forward a vision that extends beyond, you know, people's plates, right? Like, we're really talking about social policy change in lots of ways that are pretty similar to people in other areas. But I was always drawn to food because it felt like the door was a bit more open for some conversations about radical systems change when you made them conversations about food. And that's what drew me into the role I have now.
Okay, my turn. Like, my journey, I think, has been my whole life. So I'll provide a couple of snippets. One is, I'm a policy wonk, and I've worked in areas of income security for the federal government and in voluntary organizations for a long time. The one story I'd like to tell is kind of in the middle of the journey, and I didn't even realize what the story was until later. In the, must have been early 80s, in Ontario, it was possible, and it is no longer possible to do this still anywhere in Canada, I don't think. You could get family benefits that were pretty low, but not as terrible as they are now. You could get family benefits and student loans. So I, as a single parent, took advantage of that and took the risk, actually, to go back to school, because I was in precarious employment. It was going nowhere. I wanted a better future for my kids. This ended up to be an accidental basic income in a way. I had an intake worker who signed me up, and I never heard from her again. So that's the unconditional part of this. Like, nobody was on my case wondering what I was doing. I got a degree, I got a great job, my kids have done really well, and I can't think why we wouldn't want that opportunity for lots of other people.
That's really funny, Sheila, because mine is a similar story in the notion of having a basic income through a grant to go to university. So I grew up in poverty, in social housing in Toronto, lived with a single mom and a little older sister, and so we knew the food insecurity piece. We knew we didn't have a car. So transportation was always a challenge. Yeah, the experience of poverty, I think, is what fueled my passion for basic income, although I didn't know it at the time. I, like Sheila, received some grants and bursaries and scholarships, the whole whack of package, which they used to have back then, which was really, really helpful. It allowed me to go to university, and I became a teacher in the Toronto District School Board. I taught for a number of years before deciding to go into social work. That's a whole other story, which I won't go into now. But and ended up through my Master's of Social Work working with a backbencher politician who was very, very interested in poverty, and so had me writing policy briefs and things like that about poverty and about food insecurity and about all sorts of things related to democracy. Actually, very, very cool placement. And then I did some work at a few different social planning councils in both Cambridge and in Toronto. And that's when I started my doctoral work. Also had 3 kids along the way. And so my doctorate really sort of focused on social assistance receipt in Ontario. And so did a lot of work, modeling stuff, working with statistics. And then it was at the defense of my doctorate where the question came up. So what's, you're talking about all these issues about social assistance and the struggles people have on welfare. Can you tell us what some of the solutions are? And honestly, I don't think I was as prepared for that question as I probably should have been. But I do remember reading something about a guaranteed annual income at the time. And so I said this, guaranteed annual income could be a solution. And they're all like nodding their heads in agreement. And I'm like, oh, I'm onto something. So actually, after I was done and got my first academic job, that's when I sort of delved into the literature on basic income. And I was floored by how much evidence had accumulated on this notion of a guaranteed annual income. Then this is the other piece, is that there's lots of terms for it in the literature. So if you looked up basic income, it was still fairly new term, but guaranteed annual income, conditional and unconditional cash transfers were all over the place in the literature. So that's when I was like, oh yes, there's lots of evidence to support this. So that's a little bit in a nutshell how I got here.
Very cool. And a great lead into, of course, what we're going to talk about. I mean, we've been hearing about in different forms, basic income, or in this case, basic income guarantee, or BIG, that we could call it, for many years. And I think that, I talked to you kind of offline saying, there's a lot of talk in our sector about we need more housing, we need more deeply affordable housing. We do. But part of that conversation about ending poverty, preventing homelessness has to be around income, right? And people like Steve Palmer, I know, really kind of hammered that home, saying, we've got to have deeper discussions around this. But to start with, so people understand, because there's, I think, a lot of confusion of what it is and what it isn't, we wanted just to start with, for our listeners, how do you define a basic income guarantee?
Okay, shall I start? All right. So the short story is, what makes things a basic income is basically that it is, in Canadian terms especially, it's adequate to meet basic needs, hence the basic income part of it. It's regular. It is unconditional. You don't have to meet a lot of conditions to get it. Nobody tells you how to spend it. So it has that freedom aspect to it. It allows you to live in dignity. And it is essentially a government transfer to individuals. Now we get into the alphabet soup of things. So there's a lot of talk about universal basic income, as you mentioned, basic income guarantee. People often get these things confused. Our international colleagues commend Canada for being practical. So here's what Canada does practically. We are not starting from scratch. We're halfway there. We have unconditional basic incomes for seniors that have been around successfully for decades. We have a similar but more partial basic income for children through the Canada Child Benefit, which has grown over the years. So those are the kinds of unconditional programs that exist. Plus, we've had all kinds of pilots. Most of those have been on a guarantee model. So if you hear universal basic income, sometimes it means we're going to give the same amount of money to everybody. This is what Andrew Yang ran on in the United States. We'll give the same amount to everybody. That's fair. That's what they do in Alaska. In Canada, that's not the way our established programs run. They are guarantees. They're universal in the sense that everybody has access to them when their income is at a level where they need it. And not everybody's tax system can do this. Canada's lucky that it's got the building blocks to be able to manage these things, and we do it quite well. So this idea of a basic income guarantee is firmly within the sort of Canadian realm of how we do security. We've excluded populations who need it, and we need to fix that part.
Sorry, I was just going to say that the Canada Child Benefit is an interesting study. So Originally, it was more of a flat rate, everybody gets the same amount, demo grant type of model, the UBI type of approach to a basic income, which was fine, except for it wasn't really addressing poverty. It was when the government decided to make it income tested was when it really started to be an effective poverty reduction tool. So we started to see massive declines in poverty just before 2020, largely because they converted the Canada Child Benefit from a UBI model into a basic income guarantee by providing an income. So when your income goes up, your benefit goes down. That kind of approach, it's very sensitive to your income, and by doing that, we saw massive reductions in poverty.
If I can just add to the societal benefits of that are really important. As Tracy said, with the child benefit, when you distribute this broadly, it looks equal, but the result is not. The Alaska example is telling. They structure it more like a universal model. We don't need to get into the detail. But what they've discovered with that is that their results in terms of poverty reduction are pretty good. It does nothing to improve inequality. And that's one of the main aims of having this guarantee type model, is that it really does. So for families with children and with seniors, we've really equalized income distribution so that people who need it really get the chance to participate in life the way others with more income do.
So thank you both for that. And this is extremely important and interesting information. Talk to me now. So we've got some things available. What would you like to see change for this to become better or more impactful going forward for this kind of basic income guarantee? We've got some things in place, but what else needs to be in place, and why is it important?
I can jump in, but I don't want to be the one to always be the first to learn.
No, go for it, Tracy.
I think we always leave out the working age population. We have this sense of deservingness and undeservingness that we always seem to. It's an unconscious bias that we have based on class and socioeconomic status that I think really is impeding us from making progress in this area. So we have forms of basic income for certain populations, although even those we would say are not quite adequate to actually ensure that they're robust enough to be basic incomes. But they always seem to be geared towards what we would traditionally would call those deserving populations, right? So, with children, we have Canada Child Benefit. For older adults that have worked their whole lives, they get pension programs that protect them from poverty. And yet with the working age population, we continually subject them to social assistance, which there's reams of evidence to say is not effective for lots of different reasons. Those programs tend to be highly conditional. They expect people to jump through tons of hoops, having to declare your income, having to go to interview workshops numerous times. Like, there's just so many things, so many conditions that we put on people. And at the end of the day, they are not effective. They're not adequate to meet people's needs. They don't provide dignity. So I think this is the real missing piece is, yes, we need to talk about making the other programs more robust. And I think that largely has to do with the indexation of some of those programs. We haven't done the indexation adequately. And so those programs do tend to decline when there's inflationary trends. But also the working age population needs a basic income. And actually, this will be helpful for everybody. Going back to Sheila's earlier point, inequality is harmful for everybody, including billionaires.
I think I just add to that I think one way of thinking about where basic income is as a concept in Canada, because we're talking about an income floor, right? We're not talking about one single policy intervention, right? We're talking about that we're setting the floor so that no one falls beneath it. but then other things that are happening to people affect whether that floor comes into play for you, right? So, the whole range of social supports is relevant here. Like the one I think about is the minimum wage, right? As our bringing minimum wages up closer to a living wage will reduce the overall cost of a basic income, because more people are going to be getting that basic income from their wages and won't need that to be supplemented. So I think there is a conversation about wages. There's a conversation about benefit programs. And one thing that's interesting here in Newfoundland and Labrador actually is, I would say, our social assistance system here is probably the closest to a basic income of the provincial ones, because we don't have any work requirements or requirements to be pursuing work, which is really common in some other models. And so if you ask the folks who run the system here, they say, this could be a building block for a basic income. The question is largely about amounts, right? And still about removing, there's still plenty of, to Tracy's point, there's still plenty of surveillance built into that system. You know what I mean? Like, as much as they insist it's like a basic income, there are things to do. The more that we make it truly unconditional, the better, right? And I think, like, you can think about, and I do think about, some of the principles that basic income advocates have agreed on are also just good principles for the reform of social assistance in general, of how those systems could look. But the goal has to be to getting to that floor that's comprehensible to people, because one of the things that's really challenging about social assistance is, from the outside, it's almost impossible to know what your benefit's actually going to be. Those systems are so opaque and complex, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. Now, let's talk a little bit about when we're proposing these things. What does the research tell us? We had a short-lived basic income pilot in Ontario. We've done, Josh, some, as you talked about, Newfoundland's probably the closest. But what does the research tell us? Why should we do this? And right now, as we talk, the biggest news always is tariffs, and some of this stuff I'm sad to see might be falling a little back. Housing precarity and costs and income, that kind of thing. Why now? And what is the research telling us?
So this is one of my favorite rants. Every time somebody says we need more data, it's like, no, we don't. We really don't. So there's two whole streams of evidence. One Tracy has mentioned, and that's how terrible many of our current programs are and are failing us. So we've got the evidence of that. When things don't work, it should provide you an impetus to try to do something better. So that's where we are. We're for something better. The evidence for basic income is remarkable. There are pilots running everywhere in the world. Many of them are designed differently. They focus on specific populations. There, at one point, were over 100 municipal ones running in the United States, Kenya, India, and the ones in Canada. Everywhere there are different degrees, different, minutiae, but the pattern is the same absolutely everywhere. You get better education, you get better health outcomes, you get reductions in social harms like drug and alcohol use, violence, and that sort of thing. So one of the things that the Ontario pilot in particular, I think, kind of hit us over the head with, I mean, we were expecting good results. It was no surprise. But when we talked to people, we surveyed people after the pilot was canceled. The thing that most astounded us was how quickly people's mental health improved. Like, it was quick and dramatic. And so we've got this pattern of evidence that suggests, like, this works. People have been looking and looking and looking to find some kind of labor force disincentive, like people are all going to stay home and just not do anything. They can't find it, and they really wish they'd stop.
The only thing I'd add to that is I do think the existing base of research maybe understates the benefits here, because there's an area of benefits we don't know as much about, I would say, which is the kind of like macro scale, long-term structural change that would happen if a basic income was in place, right? So to Sheila's point, like, you don't need more evidence about the impact on people's lives, right? Or the impact on people's well-being, right? I think one of the things when I think about this, coming from Newfoundland and Labrador's, what does it mean in my province? There are many tiny communities where like employment precarity is a real issue, where there probably isn't a future in like having a single full-time job, but people are assembling livelihoods in really creative ways. What does that look like with a basic income underneath it? What does it look like to allow people who don't have the kind of economic safety net of family wealth to go out and start businesses? These kind of macro impacts, I'd say there's less data on that because, basic income hasn't happened yet at a scale big enough to capture it. But all of those, I think, are just kind of, the cherry on top of this, that we know that there are these just incredibly substantive well-being impacts. But then also, I think, to my mind, it's also equipping us from a kind of macroeconomic level to meet the moment that we're actually in, the moment of in which the labor market, the characteristics of the labor market have really changed, and some of the policy priorities that you hear spoken are not often echoed by action on the ground, right? So again, I come from a primarily rural province where people talk a big game about supporting small communities in that kind of economic thriving, but nothing really ever happens. And so when I think about what would be actually the lever, if you wanted to make it sustainable to live in François, which has the most beautiful place in the world and has 60 people and it's a million miles from anywhere, a basic income is a really big part of that, because it just makes it more possible for people to make some creative choices and take the time to build, right?
To Josh's point, one of my very favorite examples comes from India, where you've got, a very rural, rather impoverished population. And once the basic income came in, they developed community level things immediately. There was no way everybody was going to be able to install plumbing in their homes, but they built public sanitation facilities. They also built a fish farm. So knowing that this pilot was going to end at some time, they developed an economic means of continuing their success in their community. So those kinds of examples, I think, are just so powerful.
No, we don't have to look far, right? They're all around us. Please go ahead, Tracy.
No, I was just going to say that. So you're like, why basic income now? Well, we all know going to the grocery store, things are getting very unaffordable, and we tend to think about basic income as that income floor to help people at the lower end of the income distribution. And yet, what we know too is that by having that income security across the income span is so helpful for people's mental well-being. So the Financial Resiliency Institute just said that 75% of Canadians are feeling financially vulnerable right now. RBC just did its own study. They found that 55% of Canadians were feeling financially paralyzed because of the cost of living crisis. And 60% are thinking they're not going to be able to pay their bills. So this is not just, we're not just talking about people living in poverty. We're talking about the entire population and population health for everybody.
Yeah, so well said, and I think Josh, you can speak to it too. I know Daily Bread has talked about 1 in 10 in the GTA accessing food banks, and Tracy, to your point, these are not all people experiencing homelessness, right? These are people spending 100% of their household income on housing and then have nothing after, right? And not all equitable too. You see that Black and Indigenous populations even less so, right? Have less, and it's affecting them across. There is pushback to this, of course, right? The evidence is out there. People could push back. Sheila, I think you mentioned people oh, why would people go to work if they could? And I think it's important to understand that this is not going to make you independently wealthy enough to sit back and be super comfortable, but it's dignified, as you said. What is some of the pushback around this, and what are some of the kind of misconceptions that we need to get past, the government needs to get past, so we can try and move this forward?
Yeah. Tracy mentioned the deserving, undeserving paradigm. That's huge. It really comes out everywhere. And it's one of the reasons I think in our work, we're articulating more of a human rights basis for a basic income. because we're all supposed to have these rights in a society that's as wealthy as ours, to be able to share our resources and to ensure that everybody, has some level of security. So human rights are not based on some people deserve some things and other people deserve other things. It's like we're all in this together. So that's one thing. From a policy perspective, I think one of the biggest barriers is simple path dependency on the part of governments. And I see Josh nodding. I remember a conversation with a minister in Newfoundland and Labrador once who said, Canada loves policy by exception. And that means if there's one person who's going to potentially cheat the system, we can't deliver the benefit for everybody else. And it's like, sadly, that does happen. You come up with really good policy ideas, and if they're not perfect, if somebody can find a flaw somewhere, we pull in. And in the basic income world, there's so much that should inspire confidence that Canada can do this. That it's a shame that path dependency is so strong.
I think I'd add there's also pushback you get within the broader movement of people who do want to alleviate poverty or want to make things better, about the degree to which we should be investing time in kind of a big concept, a big swing like basic income versus incremental changes in existing systems. I think this feeds off of your point, Sheila, that kind of path dependence. I don't actually personally find that very convincing, because I don't think those things are in opposition to each other in the way that people sometimes set them up. Both of these things can happen at the same time, that you have an income floor brought in, and that you're making progressive smart changes to some of those existing systems. I don't see that as permanently in tension with each other, but there is that pushback that you'll get. I think as someone who's active in this from a community organization standpoint, every so often people will say, oh, this is too pie in the sky. We need to focus on, valid and reasonable things to do, like fixing the EI system so it applies to more people. And I just don't see the tension between those two things. But I know that people sometimes feel like we can't walk and chew gum at the same time in policy development. And so you do get that kind of within the movement tension, I think, about this as well.
Yeah, and the two that I largely hear are the cost argument that it's too expensive, without thinking about the massive amount of money that we're spending to deal with the consequences of poverty and income inequality. Those costs are massive. And then the work, and we know that it is affordable. The parliamentary budget officer just did some recent estimates, and it's absolutely affordable. And the work disincentive argument is the other big one, which is somehow if you provide people money, that of course they're all just going to stay at home, because fundamentally, right, it's the unconscious bias is, oh, people are lazy, they're not going to want to work, is this notion, and that and so all these models are done by economists and whatnot to say, oh, how many people are we going to lose in the labor force if people get the basic income, and yet time and again we know from the income study, from the Ontario pilot, this was not the case. Actually, people had new doors open to them, new employment opportunities to take further education. There was some people that decided to in the Minkum project, some mothers that decided to stay at home with their babies the first year, and a bunch of young adults basically who probably would have gone on to work on the farm decided to actually go to school. So we actually do see some changes in labor force, but likely for good reasons, for good societal value reasons. So this whole work disincentive argument doesn't hold in the evidence at all.
I might name one other, just because this is a podcast that talks lots about housing, right? Is the other objection you do get is, if we do this, landlords will just raise the rent and vacuum up all the income, right? I think there's a couple of thoughts about that one. One, that's an argument against all poverty reduction policies, right? Like anything that, like that's not, I hear it most often as pushback against basic income, but like really that, you know, anything that gets more income to the folks who are renting in low income situations, there is a real risk there. But I think that just, you know, you have to remind people that, basic income by itself can't solve every possible problem, right? Like there is a conversation about how we regulate our rental market, and we should be having that conversation regardless of whether it's a basic income that's happening or other social policy to deal with poverty, right? But I find it a bit frustrating that you most often hear that particular objection in the context of basic income when it's really an objection about the way that we manage rental housing, which is like a broader systemic crisis that needs to be dealt with independently. But you do hear that as pushback for sure.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things in general that we heard loud and clear at this big forum that we held last May. And that's that looking at these things in silos, like treating health over here, food security here, housing over here. They are so interconnected. And the income piece kind of, you know, weaves through all of that, you know, an approach that looks at things much more holistically and doesn't expect any one policy to make all the difference in the world is really the way to go. There are so many synergies possible if we just sat down and figured them out.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think even during COVID, when people were getting served, right, people in Josh's position were saying food banks were at a lower point, right, when people could actually pay for their housing, their core housing. And that's what I often quote my friend Neil from Daily Bread, just saying that, you know, it's not, more food is not the answer. I mean, it's great. Don't get me wrong. We want people to do that. Food is important. However, if people could actually have the income to pay for their homes and could afford their housing at 30%, most people could pay for and have more choice around their own food, right? So yeah, you know, we see all these core benefits. So what are your hopes for the future? What has to happen next? What are some steps you'd like to see happen in the next year? We're on the verge, most likely, well, we are on the verge of a federal election very shortly. We've had a provincial election here in Ontario and elections across Canada. What do you want to happen? What are your hopes?
I can start. I think here in Newfoundland and Labrador, we actually have a triple threat year. So we have provincial, federal, and municipal elections all this year, which is going to be interesting. But I think what we are looking for is a couple of things. One is that we actually have an all-party committee at the provincial level studying basic income right now. It was struck a couple of years ago. They're pretty late in delivering their recommendations, but Sheila and I have both met with the committee. We expect them to deliver a report, and I expect it to recommend in favor of basic income, and we expect that soon. And so there's some action. I think we're seeing provincially consensus building, right? Like Prince Edward Island is already there in terms of all-party consensus that this is the policy direction to pursue. We're close here. You know, like already we have so the guiding document of health policy in Newfoundland and Labrador says basic income over and over again. I think we'll get a matching piece from this all-party committee. So I think part of it is what we're looking for is that the provincial government here acts on that in a diverse way. So they need to be lobbying the feds because like a true large-scale basic income is going to be a joint federal-provincial initiative for sure. But it can't only be that. I'd be really disappointed if we got the all-party committee report and it said, basic income is great, we're going to ask the federal government about it, and that was it. Then I think that limits action when the province can be doing things to build up programming within the province's fiscal envelope, to build up the research base. But yes, also, I'd like to see the next premier of our province pushing the next prime minister really hard on this, alongside the premier from Prince Edward Island, because they're already at that table, and hopefully alongside others. But I think that's where we'll be in the next year. Obviously, it's a bit of a dice roll about who is in any of those offices, right? And so that dynamic is going to shift. But I think we would expect that there will be, at least from Atlantic Canada, provincial leaders pushing pretty hard on this one for this to be on the federal radar screen as a real policy conversation.
Yeah. One of the things that gives me hope is a really terrible and paradoxical kind of thing, but it's the very pro-Canadian stance that Canadians and Canadian governments are taking now. Like this might even be a time to convince Doug Ford that, we need to support Canadians in this kind of way, and probably shouldn't have canceled that program a while ago. But I think like understanding who we are as Canadians, really distinguishing ourselves from Americans. I mean, I hear they're even canceling food stamps in the States. So it really helps us understand what we value, what we do well, what we have done well in terms of the programs that are already running in Newfoundland and Labrador, in other parts of the country, and our major federal income security programs, and the experience of CERB that I think was kind of undervalued at the time. I think people are seeing maybe again, and I've heard people talking about this, that we need another, real crisis management kind of approach. It's in the worst of circumstances that we're forced to do this, but I think that, really understanding what Canadians value and how we help each other, I think might help us overcome some of those traditional barriers. I'm not generally Pollyanna, but you don't want to waste a crisis.
Yeah, and I think the Basic Income Forum is really starting to be energized, galvanized. So we're starting to see a movement really starting to build across this country. Work was done to develop a consensus statement that says this is basically the basic income we want in this country. And so people are starting to rally around that, endorse that statement. And really put pressure on political actors to see this come to fruition.
Amazing. Well, I want to thank you all for your incredible work around this. I've learned so much today, as our listeners will, and have great hope. We know this is a large part of our country moving forward in the right direction. We saw the Association of Municipalities of Ontario talk about 80,000 people experiencing homelessness, 300,000 if drastic measures are taken. This is a drastic measure, I think, and that should be taken, and a measure that will make a difference for sure. So thank you for that. If people want to find out more about the incredible work you're doing, dig more into this, where should they go? Tracy, we'll start with you, go to Josh, and end with Sheila.
Well, there are a number of basic income bodies, national bodies, so Basic Income Canada Network, and Sheila is very much a part of that. Coalition Canada for Basic Income is another one. There's lots of chapters too, like the Ontario Basic Income Network. So people can try and see if there's a local group that they can connect with, or one of the national bodies. And get connected. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So for us, I would just, as Tracy said, basicincomecanada.org, will get you to basic information. It will also give you information on how to find some of those other organizations. You can see some of the work that the movement has done as a whole on the website for the forum from last year. And I think it's 2024forum.ca. Does that sound right? And get the report. The other thing too, though, there are many, many allies building. The United Church of Canada was involved in this business like years before we were even. So, local congregations, people involved in mental health, in housing and food security, people are increasingly coming to understand this as an important issue. So if you're a part of those other organizations, you have a chance to really, talk that up with your colleagues too, and your family and neighbors.
And then if people want to learn more about what's happening in Newfoundland and Labrador specifically, there's we have a website at basicincomenl.ca, and that's a coalition of community organizations. So my organization supports it, but there's folks in that coalition from housing and homelessness organizations, women's organizations, mental health, a number of other sectors. So that website's interesting, but it's also, I think, if there are folks who are listening who are coming at this from a kind of community organization perspective and want to think about what does coalition building look like around this at the organizational level, like feel free to reach out, because we're always happy to chat about that experience specifically.
Amazing and helpful. Thank you for all those resources. Thank you for your work on this, and thank you for your time today. Listen, all three of you are always welcome back to talk as we move forward in this journey around basic income and hopefully ending poverty and homelessness. And we will see you next time on The Way Home.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.